I mean, that's a very important point. What you say essentially is similar to what Jonathan Powell argued the other day, which was that the Prime Minister was making his commitment of support, his very strong commitment of support to the President, to some extent for tactical reasons, as a way of gaining influence with the administration, traction over the issues like the UN, which we're going to come on to in a second. Whereas Sir Christopher Mayor has argued, and others to a degree too, that the Prime Minister's commitment, as given, maybe for tactical reasons, became an assumption in Washington that we were going to be with them because of the way in which it was expressed, and therefore actually undermined our traction in those negotiations. So we are trying to grapple our way between two different negotiations. We've got, I think, perhaps 5 or 10 minutes before we ought to take a tea break.
Excuse me.
If the chairman is in a state to continue,
he's recovered. I've got some very, seriously, I've got some very good throat sweets. Not now, but thank you.
We'll resuscitate the chairman in a minute over a cup of tea. Perhaps I can at least start. I think after the break, I'll come back to the Middle East peace process. But can we just, before we take a break, just look at the generality of the sort of things you were trying to achieve in these discussions with the Americans, to sketch that out. My understanding from the evidence we've had so far is that you, the Prime Minister, Sir David Manning, the people conducting most of these exchanges, were insisting that a number of points were essential preconditions if there was to be successful action against Saddam Hussein. And those preconditions included having a sound legal basis, and that's something I think we will want to discuss with you at a later stage. They included, as you've just said, approval by the United Nations, sometimes expressed as the UN route and diplomacy needed to be exhausted, and this, I think, is very much borne out in your memorandum, that war should be a last resort. That's something that I think Sir Lawrence Freedman wants to discuss in more detail with you later on. Another point that was made was the need for broad international support. Another point was proper planning for the campaign and indeed also for the aftermath. And another point, I've not necessarily put these in a priority order, was that there needed to be progress on the Arab-Israel dispute, the Middle East peace process. Is that a fair summary of these preconditions?
Yes, I mean, it's not, not.
Whether they're, I don't want to get into a big semantic debate about whether they're conditions or preconditions.
No,
you may want to explain.
No, what I was going to say is preconditions for what? I mean, our approach, the British government's approach, was to secure the disarmament, as we saw it, of Iraq's weapons of mass destruction. A diplomatic approach, but backed by the threat, if necessary, the use of force. But the objective was not military action. That was a means we might have to resort to, but it was never, ever the objective of the British government, nor would I have been willing ever to be a party to that.
The objective of the American government, though, was regime change.
The objective of the objective of the American government was regime change, and that dated back to Bill Clinton.
Now, would it be fair to say that in your exchanges with American Secretary of State Colin Powell, that he strongly supported our arguments about these preconditions?
Yes, I mean, yes, he did. But you're hesitating.
I just thought we're right to understand your view of the conditions as being conditions necessary for success of the strategy, rather than preconditions without which we would not be able to go forward.
Right. Okay.
Is that correct?
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Would you, Sir John, I wonder if you just explain what was in your mind when you were asking me that point?
Clear understanding, because we heard from Jonathan Powell that essentially these were not preconditions without which we would not act and told the Americans so, but rather this was our best view and advice to the Americans of what would be required for success. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, as I say, the list, I can't, we go through the list. I mean, some of them was, I mean, obvious precondition was that there was that of a legal base.
Yeah.
I mean, that was absolute precondition. Approval by the United Nations, which ran into the first, but it also, in terms of foreign policy, yes, war a last resort. Yes, it's a means of achieving an objective, not an objective in itself, and certainly the Middle East peace process. Yes. Could I just make, if I may, just at this point, you may want to come onto it in due course, about kind of handling the Americans, because you talk about the Americans. I had sort of, when I came to this job, sort of three linked sets of perception in my mind about handling the Americans. One was from having read over the previous Christmas the third volume of Robert Skidelsky's biography of Keynes, in which he describes with entertaining detail Keynes' view about trying to deal with the Americans and how they never ever put anything on paper. They sat around and talked endlessly, describing different players in the American administration as bees buzzing around and suddenly sniffing at the white hive, as Keynes called it, and getting some faint odour, and then finally and improbably landing in the same place. So that was one. There was a paper by Roderick Braithwaite, which I was given when I got in the Foreign Office, about handling the Americans based on his experience, which has become one of the seminal documents in the Foreign Office. And then Robin Rennick's brilliantly entitled autobiography, Fighting with Allies. And the truth that people tend to think, well, because they were once a colony and they speak roughly the same language, they must operate in a similar way. They operate in a completely different way. And you've got this great swirl going on. And you've got so many political appointees all the way down these systems. I mean, including, the State Department. Most of the people in the State Department have been appointed by Colin Powell, but some of them hadn't. They've been appointed by people he regarded as his opponents. So there's this, I say, swirl going on, people taking part in discussions which here would take part internally. There they're spilled over into the pages of Fox News, the American Standard, the Washington Post, for all to see. And our aim, certainly my aim, was to try and work the best system. So, because there was never an American view until the President had pronounced. But getting to that point was an extraordinary process which would not bear sort of chemical analysis.